Welcome to our sixth lecture on casuistry. Casuistry is neither a theory nor principle of ethics. It's a method. It's an approach, a way in which we begin to work on a case or on a problem in ethics. It is an ethical method that compares new case studies to a pool or bank of cases that have already been resolved in order to glean lessons from these resolved cases that might be applicable to new cases. The mode of reasoning analogy, and I've used mode of reasoning analogies before, if you remember. With the common good, we use comparison shopping. With deontology, we use the job description. And in this case, the mode of reasoning analogy is legal argumentation. If you've ever seen, and I'm sure most of you have, you either have or you don't have a TV, or you've never been to a movie. Legal argumentation is the mode of reasoning analogy, and you probably have, in your experience, seen hundreds of TV shows and movies that place you within a courtroom setting where the lawyers are using a kind of argumentation where they say, well, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, this is what happened, this is what they concluded, and from these conclusions, we can apply these conclusions by analogy to our current case. Or they make in Plessy versus the people of the United States, this case came to this conclusion about this particular aspect of the case, and given that precedent that has been set in this previous case, which we can relate to this one by analogy, we can take that precedent and apply it here. Well, that's exactly what casuistry is. Casuistry is, in so many ways, this courtroom setting where you are placed in the role of being a lawyer, a defense lawyer or a prosecuting lawyer. And you have a case coming before you, and you are going to argue either the prosecution or the defense. And what you're going to do is you're going to use a variety of argumentation, arguments we've already learned about, like common good, deontology, and others. But you're also going to relate the current case to previous cases we've studied. So one of the first cases we studied was Ford Pinto, or the Plasma International case, or some of these other cases that we've really already been over, and maybe we've hashed and rehashed them a bit, and we've come to some kind of conclusion, at least in part, about what the morality of certain actors and their behavior within those cases. We can begin to, if we can draw an analogy between, say, the Ford Pinto case and the current case that I'm studying, then I am engaging in the method of casuistry at some level. Casuistry begins with what are known as paradigm cases, and paradigm cases are cases that readily yield one or more principles or lessons that are transferable in application to other cases. And here we were just talking a minute ago about the Ford Pinto case, which at some level is becoming a kind of paradigm case for business ethics. It's told again and again, and virtually every time I go to a business ethics conference or every time I open a business ethics textbook, I do find some kind of reference to the Ford Pinto case. That's true of a number of the other cases that we study in this class, but the Ford Pinto is becoming in some ways this paradigm case. Once we have a paradigm case established, that paradigm case should yield some kind of principle. Now, the Ford Pinto case probably yields a number of principles, but one of the principles it might yield would be to avoid placing monetary value on human life. Because, of course, this is what they did when they drew up that cost-benefit analysis. They more or less put a monetary value on human life, a monetary value of about $200,000, if I'm not mistaken. Once we have that principle, we can apply that, or it's possible, it's potentially something we can apply to another case, like, for instance, the Plasma International case. And the Plasma International case, of course, brings up this idea of placing monetary value on human life, both in the supply of the blood, when the African suppliers, the African villagers, were being paid only 15 cents a pint for their blood, but also in the Plasma International case, it's the idea that customers have to pay for blood, and in a market where supply and demand, or the laws of supply and demand apply, then we can imagine a situation where in the future, if blood is supplied only by a market and market-based forces, that a tragedy like, for instance, a hurricane striking Honduras would do just the opposite of what's necessary in that case. That is, it would drive the price of blood up to the point where probably the people of Honduras, a relatively poor, underdeveloped country, would be unable to purchase the blood that they need more than virtually anyone else at that time. So in this case, it raises the question of whether market forces are the proper way in which to, in so many ways, supply blood to any given market, and whether that, in some ways, is placing a monetary value on human life. What are some of the characteristics of casuistry? First of all, its first and most important element is this use of cases. The chief tools of deliberation are settled cases, resolved real-life situations. Out of this grand pool of cases, which casuistry has, there are some cases that are true paradigm cases, cases for which a very clear principle can be found. In U.S. legal practice, we can undoubtedly come up with a number of cases like Brown versus Board of Education, a civil rights case that yields a very clear principle that is paradigmatic. We could say Roe versus Wade is another one of these cases that yields a principle that is paradigmatic, a woman's right to choose. These sorts of things are known as paradigm cases. It includes inductive reasoning by analogy. And by inductive reasoning, I would harken back to our discussions of consequentialism and relating and contrasting that with deontology. Consequentialism is very inductive reasoning. It begins with data, it begins with experience, and from gathering all of this different experience together, it comes to more general principles. Deontology begins with general principles and then tries to apply these to our experience, to our individual events and individual circumstances. Casuistry, like consequentialism, is very inductive. It's beginning with experience, beginning with lived life, beginning with the concrete data and moving on from there. The fourth characteristic of casuistry is that it yields maxims. It yields principles. Deliberations invoke pithy sayings that embody a particular truth and act as shortcuts in discourse. So as I was saying before, the Ford-Pinto case might yield the maxim, do not place a monetary value on human life. Complexity. One of the characteristics of casuistry is that deliberations retain their situational messiness. That is, in casuistry, we don't just talk about the maxims, these general principles, we also talk about the particulars of the case. And often, when we are deliberating using casuistry, it comes down to, what are clearly the things that we can relate, and the things that really contrast with one another in the two cases we're trying to compare. And it does come down to the dirty little details, talking about, splicing the hairs, so to say, and, really getting down and talking about the situational messiness of the cases. Probability. Casuistry, most versions of casuistry require that we do a probability analysis. What choice will most probably yield the good or the ethical result? Deliberations de-emphasize absolute certainty of judgments in favor of high probability. This goes back to something we were talking about really in our discussions that were critical of consequentialism and deontology, which we found out both of those systems, at least some versions of them, like utilitarianism and Kant's categorical imperative, came out of a very empirical, very scientific, and very certain, in the sense that they try to pretend to be certain of the conclusions that they come to. Casuistry never presumes that there is absolute certainty and an absolute true and correct answer. It always recognizes that there may be a number of different resolutions to a case. What they're looking for is the one that most probably will yield ethical, good, beneficent results. Casuistry also relies on cumulative arguments. Going back to the legal courtroom setting that we were talking about 5-10 minutes ago. If you remember, when lawyers get up and make their final appeal, they do so by making a cumulative argument. They sum up all of the arguments that they have made and more or less say, this person is either guilty or not guilty based on, and then they go through a litany of however many arguments support their way of looking at things. Again, this is very unlike utilitarianism or Kant's categorical imperative. Their arguments are very kind of straightforward. You apply, for instance, in Kant, you merely apply one basic principle, the categorical imperative. You must choose that option which, you must choose the option which would can be universalized in all and every circumstance. And always choose the option that treats other human beings as ends unto themselves and never merely as a means to an end. And that's it. That's the only argument you need to make. And the utilitarians would say, you must always choose that which produces the greatest good for the greatest number. That's very unlike what a casuist will do. A casuist will could bring up dozens of reasons why their position is superior to their opponents, or why that option, option number 3 is better than option number 1 and 2. And will bring in all kinds of different arguments from all kinds of different philosophical perspectives and do all kinds of different comparisons of this case to many others in order to create that argument. Casuistry is also very practical. Its resolutions can be applied. Judgments are expected to be acted upon in the real world. So casuistry was always very much a practical discipline. It was never merely an academic principle or an intellectual exercise. Casuistry has an ordinary, and for that reason, has an ordinary constituency. By ordinary constituency, meaning that it's not academics in the ivory tower crowd that casuistry is done for. Casuistry is a deliberation not done by experts for experts. It's a deliberation done by practitioners in order to help them in their practice. Characteristics of the business case. Now, we've looked at characteristics of casuistry. Let's look at what business cases normally do. And what we've been reading in this class are business cases. It's a tool for deliberation, and it's a vehicle for our classroom discussion. It's a record of a real-life managerial dilemma. And it's a clinical study of events. It's focused on a specific time, and it's focused on particular facts. And I'm not going to go into great detail in discussing each one of these because I think there's a way in which some of this is very self-evident. You've read through a lot of cases now by this point in the course, and what I'm saying here shouldn't be surprising to you. If it is, please email me, contact me. It emphasizes decision-making. Business cases are short, lightly footnoted. Now, some of the ones that we've read have gone on for 8 or 10 pages, but most of them tend to be just a few pages long. They're shorter than a chapter in a book, that's for sure. And they tend to be very open-ended. Not all of ours have been completely open-ended, but most of them leave you with the last paragraph to write. You're the one who now has to complete this case by discussing, deliberating, thinking through, and making some kind of decision, based on ethical theory and ethical principle. It's concerned with human relations, and usually they're controversial and pertinent. Pertinent in the sense that they're applicable, and they make sense to you here and now, and probably to you in your near future. Probably many of you, most of you, will find yourself in a business circumstance in the near future, and may find yourself in circumstances that are at least similar to the ones that are found in our cases. I'm just going to go through some of the case types that our author lists in his article. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not really important for you to know. But as I read through this list, think of some of the cases that we've studied in the class so far, and probably many of them will fall under these categories that I'm going to list. Iceberg cases are those that offer a sample of a situation. It's the tip of the iceberg, so to say. So, for instance, when we get to Enron is very much a tip of the iceberg case. Enron was one of dozens of companies in the very early years of this decade or this last decade, in 2000, 2001, 2002, that were caught in these very scandalous accounting practices and other practices, not just scandalous accounting practices. Predictive series of cases, those which the diagnosis and action recommended of the first case may be compared with the reality of the chronologically next case. So we could take a look at, for instance, the Ford Pinto case and look at a series of cases of automotive manufacturing companies that have failed at one level or another to implement known, or not implement safety hazards, but to prevent safety hazards. And we could look at these as a predictive series of cases. Multimedia cases, those that rely on audiovisual augmentation. Living cases, those where one or more executives are questioned by the class to discover the facts of the situation before analysis and action planning. There have been situations where we've had executives who are currently in prison come into class and kind of give their perspective on what happened in their case. That would be a living case. Focused decision cases, those where the decision to be made is fairly clear, and the task is to analyze alternatives and decide the best course of action. So it's one of these cases where multiple decisions are laid before us as various options. For instance, the Ford Pinto case does that because we have really three options. We can fix the tank, go back and re-engineer it, take a year, take the hit financially, but really go back and re-engineer that fuel tank. Or we can place a rubber bladder around that fuel tank, costs less, probably won't result in perfect safety for the consumer and the driver. Nevertheless, it's a great improvement over doing nothing. Or, number three, we can do nothing, which is precisely what Ford did in regards to the Pinto. That's a focused decision. Unfocused decision cases are those where the task is to discover and define the problem and then decide the best course of action. It's where there really isn't a decision to be made. It's really deciding, what is the problem? And, there are a variety of cases like that. We will have a case in this class where one of the situations is a person claiming that they have been sexually harassed. But there's very little evidence other than her claims that she's been sexually harassed. There's no witness, there's no video evidence of this, and there's a way in which what this helps us do is ask questions of course, what is sexual harassment? And why is it problematic in an employment setting, in any setting? But why is it, especially problematic in a setting where we are business leaders? Implementation cases, those that include the question of how the favored decision is to be implemented. The decision's been, in an implementation case, the decision's been made. The question is now, how do we implement it? And we have a number of these cases in this class. We have a number of cases where companies are in a foreign situation, a situation where, for instance, Motorola in China or somewhere else, where the cultural and legal assumptions are very different. The company's already made the decision. The company already has a policy about the kind of behaviors that employees have engaged in. But the problem is how they are going to implement those policies in a legal and cultural setting that is very, very different than the United States, where these policies were developed. Appraisal cases, where the immediate problem is not readily apparent and where one has to ask penetrating questions to uncover the assumptions, processes, and characteristics of the organization in situations that are under investigation. We have some bias cases, racial bias and gender bias cases in this course that are appraisal cases, cases where we have to unearth what exactly the issue is. Simple or complex cases, those that vary according to student capabilities and where they are used in a course of study. We move in this course really from simpler cases to more complex cases, and that's how this course has been designed. Case method objectives, and again, I'm going to move a little more quickly through this slide. Greater knowledge, case method objectives, one of the objectives of using case method is to improve the knowledge of the students who are coming through this class. Knowledge in the sense of you have a better idea of the experiential element of the business situation. You have a better situational grasp of the kinds of things you'll be facing if you use a case method approach, rather than if all we did in this class was spend all of our time, talking about ethical theory. You'd walk away knowing ethical theory, but you wouldn't have the knowledge base, the situational knowledge base, to apply that very well. It helps individuals gain an understanding of a particular subject, in this case, business in relation to ethics. It helps you develop some technical expertise. It provides a forum to practice and master particular analytic techniques, applying different ethical theories to cases. It develops good habits of analysis. It stimulates clear thinking, analysis, and curiosity so that these may become natural and automatic with time and practice. It gives you a manager's perspective. It encourages the broad entrepreneurial and administrative perspective essential to effective business management. It gives you problem-solving skills. And of course, I think, again, a lot of this is self-evident at this point in the class because we've already been through a number of weeks of this. You have already been through a number of cases. And of course, problem-solving skills are things that you've been honing for the last number of weeks. Gives you communication skills, again, for obvious reasons, on the discussion board. Especially, you've been doing a lot of texting and communicating with one another in regards to these theories and, honing and sharpening those skills. You have, again, at the discussion board, begun to develop some consensus building. And that's, of course, not just important here in this class. It's going to be important for you later when you are inserted into a business setting and you're in a team situation. You have to learn how to develop some consensus building skills. It also does some personal development, strengthens your individual sense of internal security and facilitates leadership on your part. What are some of the similarities between case method in business and casuistry? Since there are differences, but what are some of the similarities? They're both instrumental. Both are tools of deliberation. They're methods. They're not theories. Both record actual events. So casuistry and case method always use actual case or very realistic cases. Maybe the names have been changed and situations have been altered a bit because of confidentiality and other things, but they're real in the sense that something very much like that has happened in business, if not, that really did happen. Manifold, both are complex and consider the complications posed by situations. Both facilitate, they rely on shortcuts to expedite reasoning. They're comparative. They rely on comparison and analogy in order to make the argument. They're precedent-seeking. They're both seeking standards that have already been set by previous cases and dilemmas that have already been solved. They're both practical in that they both stress the relevance in our concrete, day-to-day, everyday practical business situations. They're cumulative. They both gather arguments to support or rebut a position. They both use probability. Both emphasize the probability rather than certainty of a judgment. And both distill in the sense that they draw out the salient elements of a dilemma. And they both contextualize a situation by giving us the social, environmental situation in which a true business event happened and that has moral implications. What are the main differences? And here's where we'll end the discussion. Case resolution. Casuistry's cases are resolved, or at least the ones that they depend on tend to be resolved, and we have paradigm cases. Business cases are typically open-ended and inconclusive. So that's one of the differences between casuistry and business ethics cases. Order. Casuistry maintains a taxonomy of cases. Business cases float freely without order. At least currently, that's what's happening. It could be in the future that business case method does become a more structured casuistic kind of taxonomy. nomination. Casuistry's paradigm cases may be named such because agreement on an issue and its moral weight is possible within a particular culture. Particular business cases may in fact be paradigmatic, but these cases are not named as such because there's no naming body and there's no consensus. So, for instance, a casuistic system that's well developed, of course, is the American legal system. In that system, there is an authoritative naming body that tells us what cases are resolved and what cases get repeated again and again so that they become paradigm cases. There's no such centralized body in business and in the use of business cases, so we don't have that same kind of situation. Well, I hope this discussion of casuistry has helped clarify some of the things that were covered in the article that you've read, and hopefully from here on out you'll feel free to use this case method, casuistry, to compare cases to one another. So far we've been analyzing cases using theories and principles. Now feel free to compare cases to one another and to try to draw conclusions about a current case from conclusions that have already been drawn from previous cases.